Greetings and welcome to the 2026 National Invasive Species Awareness Week webinar series. My name is Tegan Wilmot and I serve as your Education and Prevention Manager at NISAW. Please say hello in the chat and share with us where you are joining from today. Thank you so much for being here for day 2 of National Invasive Species Awareness Week for our webinar, Alberta Wild Boar Control Program Challenges and Successes. We are excited to once again be hosting National Invasive Species Awareness Week, an international event powered by NISAW that brings attention to invasive species, the impacts they have across North America, and the actions we can take to prevent their spread. This year's theme is Defending Our Health by Stopping the Spread. The theme highlights the many ways invasive species affect not only ecosystems, but also human health and economic stability, including impacts to agriculture, infrastructure, recreation, and community well-being. It also emphasizes the importance of proactive prevention, early detection, and coordinated response to reduce these risks. NISAW provides a platform for people from local, state, federal, tribal, and regional agencies, nonprofit organizations, private industry, academia, and concerned citizens to come together and engage with decision makers around legislation, policy needs, and on-the-ground solutions. This week is designed to support both learning and action. Throughout the week, we will be sharing links and resources to help you connect with your U.S. senators and House representatives. We want elected officials to hear directly from practitioners, partners, and community members about why invasive species prevention and management matter and why sustained support and funding are essential. For those who want to take a more active role during NISAW, we encourage you to visit NISAW.org and explore the NISAW Toolkit, which includes template social media posts, press releases, and outreach materials. And if you're not already connected with NISAW on social media, please follow along and help amplify our daily messages. We had a fantastic webinar yesterday by the USGS, and that recording will be posted sometime soon. But we have lots of great presentations still to come, including topics such as New World screwworm efforts in Mexico, marine biosecurity and public health, and the connections between invasive species and food security in the United States. We encourage you to visit our website to view the full schedule and register for additional sessions. And if you're unable to attend a webinar live, recordings will be posted to our YouTube channel following the event. Before we welcome our speaker today, I would like to take a moment to share a brief overview of NISAW for those who may be new to our organization. NISAW, the North American Invasive Species Management Association, is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to empower invasive species management in North America. We serve professionals, practitioners, and researchers working across disciplines to prevent, detect, and manage invasive species. NISAW is guided by 16 board members and supported by 10 active committees that help shape and strengthen our programs. We have a team of 7 staff members and a membership that continues to grow each year. We currently communicate with over 15,000 subscribers and engage with over 38,000 social media followers. During National Invasive Species Awareness Week last year, our collective outreach reached more than 3.4 million people, and we are excited to continue expanding that impact this year. At NISAW, we provide the connection, the voice, and the tools needed to address invasive species across North America. Our work is organized around these 3 core pillars. We create opportunities for collaboration and knowledge exchange through webinars, summits, our annual conference, and professional discussion boards. Our goal is to connect practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and partners so they can learn from one another and strengthen their impact. We elevate invasive species issues on a national stage through our government relations program and initiatives like National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We work to ensure that decision makers understand the importance of this work and the need for sustained support and funding. And we equip our members and partners with practical resources for prevention, management, and outreach. This includes Play Clean Go, the NISAW Shop, the Certified Weed-Free Products Program, Mapping Data Standards, and NISAW Academy. One of the most important ways we facilitate connection is through our NISAW annual conference. Each year, over 300 invasive species professionals gather to share research, case studies, and management experiences. This year's conference will be held in Alexandria, Virginia from October 19th through the 22nd with the theme Local Leadership, Global Impact. We have some great keynote speakers lined up already, and registration is now open. We are also accepting abstracts, and you can learn more on our website. As a friendly reminder, your membership dues help to fund our educational programs like this webinar. If you're not currently a member, we offer a variety of different membership options. You can view our membership structure on our website, nisma.org. And if you're unable to become a member right now, we encourage you to make a donation. Every gift, no matter the size, helps to support our programming. One of our newest member benefits is our NISMA discussion boards. When you become a member, you'll have access to these boards where you can ask your peers questions, share resources, discuss emerging challenges, and learn from peers across different sectors. Is someone else trying to manage the same species as you? Are there new innovative solutions that might help you solve a problem? This is a great place to start. We also have invasive species news, job opportunities, and trainings listed too. We're really excited about this new member benefit and hope you will join us on the discussion board soon. If you want to sponsor NASMA in a bigger way, our Premier Partner Program is designed for you. Premier Partners enjoy benefits throughout the year, including acknowledgement on our website, at events, and more. And we'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our 2026 Premier Partners whose generosity helps to make events like this webinar possible. Each year, NASMA highlights one high-impact species through the Know Your Invasives campaign, and in 2026, the focus is on feral swine, one of the most destructive invasive mammals in North America. Impacts include damage to crops, wetlands, forests, and infrastructure, predation on native wildlife, and disease transmission. As part of this campaign, we'll be hosting an additional webinar on this species in April. We'll be sharing information about feral swine throughout the year and encourage you to help us share the message with your networks using the Know Your Invasives hashtag. As we continue celebrating National Invasive Species Awareness Week, I also want to quickly highlight the NASMA shop at shop.nasma.org. This year, we're excited to feature our brand new Know Your Invasives collection, spotlighting feral swine and the Squeal on Pigs campaign to support early detection and reporting of this damaging invasive mammal. You'll find sweatshirts, mugs, stickers, and more. And in honor of National Invasive Species Awareness Week, you can use the code NISAW26 for 10% off your purchase. Members can stack their member discount on top of that, and the promotion applies to these new items or anything else in the shop. Every purchase supports NASMA's programming, and this promotion is available this week only, so be sure to take advantage of it while it lasts. And now we'll get started with our main event. Thank you for joining us today for our NISAW webinar, Alberta Wild Boar Control Program Challenges and Successes. Before we begin, a quick note for our audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so we can make sure to address them after the presentations. Take a look first to see if your question has already been asked, and if so, give it a thumbs up to promote it to the top of the list. To get us started, I'd like to welcome Hannah McKenzie with Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation. Hannah graduated from the University of Alberta with a Master of Science in Mathematical and Statistical Biology and a Master of Science in Applied Mathematics. Prior to taking on her current role as wild boar specialist, Hannah worked with the Alberta Aquatic Invasive Species Program along with her canine partner, Seuss. Hannah employs her quantitative skills to make evidence-informed policy and program decisions. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today, and you may now share your slides.
Great. Thank you for the invitation to speak about wild boar at this Invasive Species Awareness Week. Although the talk is about the Alberta Wild Boar Control Program, I know people joining today are from all over and work on many different invasive species. So I'm going to take a bit of a step back to talk about what I've learned and give some larger context pictures around wild boar and the control program and invasive species in general. So I hope this will be something for everybody in this talk today. Now I know that the definition of an invasive species is of course familiar to this audience, but I wanted to start here so that we can spend a few minutes thinking about where wild boar have invaded from and how, and why they've been so successful as an invasive species, and also why they've become known as one of the most destructive invasive species in North America. So if we look at this map, which shows the native and introduced range of wild boar as it was understood around 2017, we can take a look at how we got here. So wild boar originated as a species in the Southeast Asian islands and then spread through natural spread and diverged into two lineages, the European lineage and the Asian lineage. And then independently in each of those locations, they were domesticated into the domestic pig breeds that we're familiar with today. And hybridization happened, kind of interbreeding back with the ancestor as well. So this is a species that has the current ancestor still present, as well as all the domestic breeds that we have today, and they can all interbreed. So lots of hybridization happens. Then beginning in the 1400s, pigs were brought with the colonizers across on ships to serve as food, both on the ship and when they arrived. And often these species or these animals were free ranged. And I think initially this would have been mostly domestic breeds that were brought across. But then in the 1900s, there was interest in having European wild boar brought over to provide sport hunting opportunities. And so they arrived and were released as well. And really in Canada, it was much later, only in the 1990s, that we saw European wild boar brought over to Canada as part of farm diversification initiatives. And this was for both meat production and hunt farms as well. So based on this history, you can see that the invasion in the southern United States started much earlier and followed a very different trajectory than the invasion we have on the Canadian prairies. Now, you've probably noticed that this invasive species suffers a bit from nomenclature confusion. The different terminology used in different regions may be related to the genetic mix that we see between domestic pig breeds and wild boar and the variation in those genetics across the invaded range. And this continues because there is continuing interbreeding and hybridization. And additionally, I think it's important to keep in mind it's not just the European wild boar ancestor that's invasive, but also the domestic breeds that have arisen from that as well. I think in the US, the term favored is feral swine, and the genetic mix in the US does lean more towards domestic breeds, while in Canada at the national level, we use the term wild pig. And I think in general, the genetic mix here leans more towards animals with more European descent and European genetics. And I think this, potentially could be because of our colder winters. And so some of the domestic breeds are just not really suited to survive in the climates that we have, whereas they are able to survive in different climates in different parts of the United States. In Alberta, we talk about wild boar because this is how it appears in our legislation. And we really have focused mainly on the wild boar and animals with a lot of European wild boar ancestry. Whereas in other parts of Canada, concerns are perhaps more focused on domestic pigs, and so terms they use reflect that as well. There has recently been a lot of work in Canada to address the threat of wild pigs. The Canadian Invasive Wild Pig Strategy was developed in 2022, and there's quite a bit of collaborative work going on under the strategy now, including the annual Canadian Invasive Wild Pig Report that you can see here. This is a map which was developed collaboratively by British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario as part of an initiative led by Animal Health Canada. And the map shows where there are confirmed reports of uncontained pigs, which are the tiny black dots, boots on the ground response activities, which are the blue shaded areas, and areas with established known free living wild pig populations, which are the orange shaded areas. And in this case, all of those orange shaded areas also have boots on the ground activity ongoing. One thing to note about this report is that confirmed reports include all types of uncontained pigs. And so those could include domestic pigs that are escaped and returned home. It could include established populations of wild boar, the whole range. So all of those reports in this map are represented similarly. And all of the established populations you see there in north central Alberta in orange, those are all European wild boar type primarily. The map is updated annually, and I think it provides a realistic picture of what we know about the distribution of wild boar across Canada, and also how much work is underway by the different provincial programs to respond to the threat of wild boar. I think it also shows there we have reporting systems in place in all the different jurisdictions, and reports are followed up, and control activities are ongoing in areas with established populations. Now, if we focus a little bit more in only to look at Alberta and the locations with established wild boar shown in gray there, It's clear that the extent of the problem is limited and patchy within the province. So these are not a widespread invasive species in Alberta at this time. However, it is important to keep an open mind and remain vigilant because there are likely small pockets of wild boar in between the areas shown here, and possibly in other areas which we're not aware of yet. We all know that with invasive species, detection is a large part of the challenge, and so that is with wild boar in Alberta as well. So part of the work of the program is to continue collecting data and doing proactive monitoring to increase our confidence in this map, both in the areas where we know there are wild boar, but also in areas where we believe wild boar are not. If we compare our current understanding of established wild boar populations with some other data sets, for example, this one, which shows 40 plus years of sightings data from Dr. Ryan Brook, I feel confident that we're on the right track and we're not missing any large areas of concern. Like our hotspots are aligning. We know we have reports in the southern part of the province, which in the case of Alberta are primarily escaped domestic pigs. There is one spot on this map that people might be wondering about, and that is the Peace region in northwest Alberta. So there are a lot of sightings from there, and these in fact are mostly from a bounty program that the government ran between 2003 and 2015. And so that would suggest that we should expect an established population there. But we had a challenge because we had very few reports to follow up on that were outside of that bounty program. So this fall, we had some more capacity with our trapping response team. And so we had one of our trappers spend a few weeks up in that region making a tour. And he met with fieldmen, a lot of people working on the ground, pork producers who are up in the area, and were able to help him make connections. And he went to all the locations where we had bounty returns and talked to landowners. And the story he heard again and again there was that there used to be wild boar 10 to 15 years ago, but no one has had any reports recently. And in fact, many people raised wild boar on small backyard farms to take advantage of the bounty program. So, anecdotal, but perhaps an example where sometimes, programs don't really quite meet the target. So his investigations really helped us understand that, the fact that we had no new recent reports from this area probably did indicate that there is no large established population up there. There were a few spots that he wanted to go back to and conduct some additional follow-up monitoring, so we will be doing that. But I think at this time, we don't believe there's a lurking population up there. So thinking a little bit about the animal now and why it's such a successful invader. Wild boar live in groups called sounders that are usually made up of several sows and their offspring, while males are typically solitary or live in small bachelor groups of 1 to 2 to 3 males, and they move between the sounders to locate receptive females. So in terms of movement, what we've observed is really the sounders are, don't move very far. As long as they have resources they need, they have habitat and they're not exposed to a lot of disturbance, they stay relatively, slow in terms of movement, whereas the males tend to move large distances to seek out sounders. And this is particularly true in areas like Alberta, which have relatively low density of wild boar. So those males have to be making large routes to encounter females. And really, wild boar check all the boxes of a successful invader. They reproduce early, potentially as early as 6 months, depending on resources. And they have litters of, on average, 6 piglets. And they can reproduce multiple times a year. So very high reproductive capacity. They're also very adaptable, both in terms of the range of environmental conditions where they can live and the food they can eat. So if you think about their widespread nature as an invasive species across the globe and all the different conditions they're inhabiting, from hot southern United States up to cold northern Canadian climates, they're very adaptable. And they have an omnivorous diet, which allows them to really take advantage of local food resources. They'll really eat anything that fits in their mouth, which could include all parts of the plant, including roots, tubers, and bulbs. Anything the plant produces, including nuts, berries, and seeds. Any part of the plant, leaves, bark, twigs, and then also many other things, including earthworms, insects, mollusks, fish, rodents, birds, eggs, lizards, snakes, frogs, and carrion. So really a wide range. They're very opportunistic in what they'll eat. And that really allows them to have large impacts on the ecosystem. For example, if there's a large production of seeds or nuts from a plant, and they could really consume a lot of those and have a large impact on the next generation of production of that plant in that local area. Of course, they also eat crops and stored feeds, which is of concern for the agricultural industry. Really, one of their few limiting requirements is access to water. They're also very intelligent, which allows them to evade and adapt to control methods, and this makes them difficult to detect and also to eliminate. Like many invasive species, they're ecosystem engineers through some of their behaviors we'll talk about in a moment. And this is why really they are known as one of the most destructive invasive species in North America. So looking at some of those destructive behaviors, rooting is probably up there as number one. This is one of the main ways that wild boar forage for food. And as you can imagine, there's a picture of a pasture from Manitoba. It destroys the vegetation, it can compact the soils and increase soil erosion and spread other invasive species. So really changing the soil ecosystem and affecting all vegetation. And in agricultural areas, in addition to damaging the crops, it creates hazards for equipment by damaging, kind of changing the structure of the field. Wallowing is another behavior that wild boar do quite frequently that's also very destructive. And they do this to regulate their body temperature for parasite or insect protection as part of their social behavior. And as you can see there from the picture on the right, they do it in all seasons. So even when there's snow on the ground up here, we see evidence of wild boar wallowing. So this has lots of negative impacts on the water quality by increasing turbidity and introducing contamination. And it also damages the sensitive wetland habitats, which a lot of other aquatic life, including fish, freshwater mussels, amphibians, and insect larvae rely on. So those are really two of the ways that they act as ecosystem engineers. They also have interactions with native species, and these could include herbivory, competition, and predation. And I think there's lots of unknowns, particularly in Alberta, because we do have low densities of wild boar. Not a lot of work has been done to understand the impacts on native wildlife. However, lots of work has been done elsewhere, and looking at just the overlap in the niches of the species, I think we can expect these impacts to be occurring. So I do often get asked about whether wild boar have any predators in Alberta. And I think, again, we're lacking a bit in research, but we do have some observations. And I think it probably does occur on some scale, like certainly if there's piglets that get separated from their sows, they would be vulnerable to predation. But under what conditions it might act to control wild boar populations at the population level, I think is unknown. We do see overlap between wild boar and some of our large predators in Alberta, including cougars and grizzly bears. But we've not found any wild boar kill sites. In fact, it is very rare to find wild boar carcasses at all. And we do see that cougars and bears can push wild boar around. So we certainly see the sounders moving in response to presence of those animals. But again, we haven't really seen a lot of evidence that that's exerting population control. One question I think does arise around wolves. A lot of our established wild boar populations are not really in wolf habitat or where we see wolves established. And so I think just the nature of the way wolves hunt in packs, they may have more of an advantage, and that could possibly be something. But I think some work needs to be done there to look at that interaction. I mentioned the agricultural damage, but just to really highlight it here, in addition to the impacts on native habitat and species, we do see a lot of damage to all stages of growth in crops, from eating the seeds after they're planted all the way up to consuming and trampling the mature crop. And while these impacts are quite localized in Alberta, given our low densities, in areas with higher densities, the economic impacts from this damage can be quite extreme and can really affect the farming operations. One impact that has really garnered a lot of attention lately, and is probably the biggest threat posed by wild boar, is their ability to introduce and spread disease. They can carry 39 different diseases that can be transmitted to livestock, humans, and wildlife. And some of these are really high concern reportable diseases. I think the main one, particularly for the pork industry in Canada, is African swine fever. This is a swine-specific disease, but the mortality rate is very high. It has large impacts on the domestic swine industry when it becomes present in domestic swine. And the concern is that if it gets into wild boar, then it is no longer easy to control the way we can manage disease outbreaks in a domestic situation. So it hasn't been detected in North America, But if it were detected in Canada, it would have an immediate and severe impact on our pork industry, and we export over 70% of our pork. And so there's a large concern around this disease. In addition to African swine fever, there's also risk to humans from other zoonotic diseases carried by wild boar. And in Alberta, for example, this can include chickenella, which is also present in bears, and avian influenza. So hopefully I've convinced you of the risks and impacts associated with wild boar and why they live up to their name as being such a destructive invasive species. So just thinking now a little bit about the invasion process and kind of connecting to some invasive species theory. I think this is, we'll speak about it a bit in Alberta, but it's quite a common story. So the transport phase really arose when they were brought from their native range to Alberta, either as livestock or game species or diversified livestock. And that was consistent in the rest of the North American invaded range. So they were present, but contained potentially, or in some cases, right out of the gate, not contained if there was free ranging pasture. And then introductions happened through either releases from containment, escape, and then once populations established, secondary introductions from those populations. And so that's kind of the release from captivity. And then from those introductions, establishment happened through survival and reproduction. And then spread began to happen both through natural spread and human-mediated dispersal. And I think in terms of wild boar, we see this in Alberta, and I know there's been some research supporting this in the United States as well, is that although natural spread is occurring out from where they're introduced, the real damaging spread comes through human-mediated dispersal. So where we're taking populations and moving them large distances and establishing them in new areas beyond the natural range of their spread. So humans, as in many invasive species contexts, have a large role in wild boar spread as well. Now, I always like to include this figure or something similar as part of any invasive species presentation. And I think it's a nice way to look at the process and connect it to the different management goals and steps. So just to take a moment and think about how much information is really contained in this graphic, the first axis on the x-axis is time since the invasive species arrived. And this shows that over time, both the area occupied and the cost incurred to society increases. And the second x-axis also reminds us that for dollars invested, the return is much higher in the early stages. And in fact, prevention is the biggest bang for your buck. And really connecting back to the disease risk, particularly for African swine fever, the experience in Europe has really shown that eradication of wild boar in advance of the disease arriving is the most effective response to the threat, both in terms of cost and chances of success. If there's wild boar present when the disease arrives, your chances of success of eliminating that disease are much reduced. Finally, the graph also highlights how there's windows where different management goals are achievable, but at some point, eradication or containment is no longer possible and you're stuck with only long-term control, which is both expensive and comes at a high cost to society. But you can see there that there's some conceptual ideas that if you impose some management actions, you may be able to exit that increase curve. And so then the question comes, thinking back to the map of Alberta, where is Alberta on this trajectory? And what does it mean for our management goals and response efforts? And I guess this is hard to know for sure, but I could guess that perhaps we're here. We have establishment, we have established populations, we're potentially seeing some spread. Although I think so far we may have been lucky to avoid a lot of the human-mediated spread. I think there's still the potential that we can kind of exit this foregone conclusion curve if we're smart about the different management activities that we take. And I would say that in the last few years, Alberta has made significant investment in our wild boar control program, both with policy support and funding, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And I think these have all been really big steps in the right direction. While there's a few remaining gaps that we're also going to touch on, I do think that eradication of wild boar is a realistic goal for Alberta. However, like our rat control program, which has given Alberta its rat-free status, and I often, strive to emulate when I think about wild boar, it will take continued investment and commitment and time, and particularly as we get down to finding and removing the last few individuals, which is always the hardest time to maintain support for a program. Just one comment about eradication versus elimination. And I like this figure from the Davis et al. Paper that sort of shows the difference. We often say eradication or elimination interchangeably, but really, I think elimination is more accurate in the case of Alberta, because I expect that if we are able to eliminate wild boar from the known areas of concern and potentially eventually from the province, there will always be a re-invasion risk. And so having a long-term early detection rapid response will be essential. So thinking about looking at the management that's happened over the years in Alberta and where we are today, during the kind of absent era when we had transport, but wild boar were conceivably still contained on farms, we started out basically with no prevention or preparedness. We didn't prevent them from coming to Alberta. We didn't really have anything, prepared in case they escaped. So we started with nothing. In 2018, we introduced a minimum containment standard for farms to try to increase containment and prevent the chances of escape. At this point, they were already kind of out of the gate, but still perhaps it helped to reduce the number of new introductions. Then in 2011, municipalities started getting on board. They looked at what was happening in other places that had farms, and a lot of them chose to implement bylaws prohibiting wild boar. And so this likely prevented a lot of farms in some municipalities. And then in December of this year, we instituted some provincial regulations which declared wild boar to be a pest in all circumstances under the Agricultural Pest Act. And as you can see on the right there, what that means is that keeping and transport of pests is prohibited, and owners and occupants of land must prevent the establishment of or control or destroy pests. So basically, this prohibited wild boar farms across the province. And I'll talk a little bit about that process next. So I think really, we have a very strong position now with these regulations. Of course, we've already had the introductions happen, but at least going forward, this is really preventing additional introductions from occurring. So similarly, I think introductions probably started occurring very shortly after wild boar were brought in as a farm animal, but we didn't start detecting these until the early 2000s due to the lag that usually happens. And in terms of detection, initially there was none, no early detection, because we had sort of a false sense of security that wild boar would not survive if they escaped, and therefore this wasn't going to be a problem. So we had no early detection in the early days. Then I think we had what I'd say is passive detection. Landowners started noticing things and talking to their municipalities. And this is what led us to realize that we had a problem. In 2022, the Alberta Invasive Species Council launched the Squeal on Pigs campaign in Alberta. So this is something that, we heard Tegan talk about, and so they collaborated with the jurisdiction in the United States that had it, and they brought it to Alberta. And this was really successful at getting the word out. And so now we had more of a reporting system in place. And then as part of the recent regulatory changes in 2025, we now have mandatory reporting of kills. So I think that may help us get some more information. And we're also introducing a proactive, multi-method, systematic reporting or monitoring approach. So trying to be more proactive. We're at the really early stages of this, of trying to get kind of the field deployments happening and figure out data management and modeling. And I'll talk about that a bit when I get to the gaps, but I think this is going to be the path forward. And so now between Squeal on Pigs and mandatory reporting and the proactive systematic monitoring, I think we're in a really strong position for early detection as well. So then looking at what about eradication and containment, so more kind of response to wild boar that are already here. Again, in the early days, uncoordinated. I imagine landowners shot what they saw and, didn't think too much about it once they didn't see them anymore. Then in 2003, when wild boar were declared as a pest when at large, so still allowed on farms, but a pest when they were outside the fence, that kind of changed things a little bit because it required landowners and occupants of land to take active measures against wild boar present on their land. Then we had some experimentation with bounty programs, 2003 to 2015, and then we had a short one in 2022 to 2024. I think we've squarely left those in the past. They're not successful, which has been shown elsewhere, and we also didn't find them successful in Alberta. Then in 2018, we moved to professional control with support from Alberta pork producers. We were able to hire some wild boar trappers, professionals who did this as their job. And we've been able to continue that as well. We have additional trappers that are working as part of our program. And then in December 1st this year, we were able to add to our regulations that hunting and trapping of wild boar is prohibited with some exceptions. And so this really means that we're focusing on professional control to get the job done in terms of controlling wild boar. So again, I think we're in a very strong position between having professional control contractors and then also regulations that prevent that opportunistic hunting and trapping, which can lead to education and dispersal of wild boar, making the professional's job much more difficult. I think this is a strong position. So then that kind of gets us to the wild boar control program. And I think in the essence of time, and because I've spoken a lot about many parts of this already, I'll just kind of skip over it. But the main message here is that it's a partnership. We work with a lot of partners that are there on the bottom, either through field delivery or research or policy. And I think that's the secret sauce to many invasive species programs, is just the partnerships and collaborations that they can have. So we spoke also about these changes, so I think we can move relatively quickly over them, but two big changes in December in Alberta. Wild boar are now declared pests in all circumstances. Hunting and trapping is prohibited with exceptions for landowners, and there's mandatory reporting of wild boar kills. So one thing that we did need to take into account is that we had existing wild boar farms in Alberta. And so with the changes, we needed to give those producers the opportunity to adjust, because it affected their business directly. So we provided a program of compensation for producers who voluntarily left the farmed wild boar industry, compensating them for animals and fencing. And the idea was that they would be able to disperse through their usual markets. And so this is not meant to be a call by any means. We allowed time all the way until May 31st, 2027 for them to raise and market their existing animals through the usual markets and wind down their operations. And I think this is an example of where with invasive species, you really need to keep in mind the human dimension, and you need to think about the other connections to society that are impacted and think of ways to address those so that we can achieve the goal. In terms of our control, I just wanted to touch on it in a bit of detail because I did hear some concerns expressed from different sides after the regulation change prohibiting hunting, that people were wondering, how would we get rid of wild boar if hunting is prohibited? So just to put those fears to rest a little bit, we have some top level professional wild boar trappers who are contracted through the end of March 2028. So having that kind of sustainable funding in place for response is pretty exciting. We also have, through a lot of great funding programs, been able to develop a deep inventory of equipment that supports the different tools that we're able to do and control methods. And some of the trappers have taken on greater roles as a field manager, for example. And so now I think that the level of program delivery is just going to be much higher because they've certainly, in their experience and skills, outgrown any leadership I was able to provide in the trapping side of things, for sure. And this is really what we've heard from other jurisdictions that have been successful, is to focus on professional control. And so that's the approach that we've taken as well. And so really they go out, we gather intelligence through a variety of sources. We focus on whole sounder trapping to prevent education and reduce reproduction. And then as with all programs, monitoring and evaluation is really important to be able to say something about what your efforts are getting you. And this is something that we're working to develop. So it's still pretty new. And so without that monitoring and a kind of measurement reporting, it's hard to answer the question, are control efforts working? These are the graphs that I can share that sort of speak to the number of reports we get over time and the number of wild boar that have been removed since professional control started in 2018. And I think it's important to avoid the human urge to see patterns here and to make inference. For example, you can see there the impact of the Squeal on Pigs campaign on public reports. It was hugely successful in raising public awareness about wild boar. I don't think that means that the number of wild boar all of a sudden jumped in that same year. Reports are biased in terms of where they occur and also how many we get, but they are a good indicator where we need to look to do additional monitoring. Same with our removals. Up until 2021, there was one person who was kind of spearheading how we could capture wild boar in Canada, like what tools we could bring up from the States to understand how to do it here. And then you see a big jump when we got our initial contractors, and then another jump when we had new people come on in 2024. And we did have a bit of a gap between 2023 and 2024 in terms of field activities. And so you wonder, was there a bit of a rebound there? But I think really it's just dangerous to be making inferences from these graphs. So this brings us to our first gap, which is around how do we address being able to measure our success. And so this is work that's in collaboration with the Pruvot Lab at the University of Calgary. And then in turn, they're working with lots of partners at the USDA and in Missouri. And they're going to take two approaches. So the first is integrated dynamic occupancy modeling. And this is taking a whole bunch of different monitoring through drone flights and ground scouting and camera traps and combining that to understand the presence and distribution of wild boar over time. And this will help us prioritize resources and quantify certainty of absence once we're able to eliminate it. And this is really based on a paper by Davis et al. In 2018 that's kind of motivating this approach, because it allows us to integrate data from control efforts as well as systematic monitoring. And then the second thing we're looking at is an integrated age structure population model. And this is really connecting with a lot of the work that's being done in Missouri. And so taking inputs around trapping effort, the number of wild boar removed, and some data around those wild boar, and coming up with a population model that can help us predict where things are going. So here's an example of a model with simulated data. But this is what we kind of hope to achieve in the end, although we hope our models are going down and not up. So I think this is really, we're at the very early stages of building the models. We're just getting our data collection online and kind of figuring out our data management pipelines. But I think this is really where we need to go, because just reporting that we removed 100 wild boar is difficult to understand what that means, because if it's 100 out of 105, then you're doing great. And if it's 100 out of 500, then you're not. And I think we just can't answer that question right now. One of the next challenges I think we'll face is access limitations. So this is an example of one of the areas that our trappers are working in. You can see the different field activities that are ongoing there. And then there's an area with the red hash grid. And those are all pieces of land where we've been denied access. And so this causes a problem because we get wild boar populations having refuges where they're able to kind of reproduce and constantly spread out of those refuges. So this is an area where we need to do some work. And although we do have the tools to require access under our regulations, I think relationship building and finding ways to work with these landowners will be more successful in the long run, because wild boar control is not a short process. You need to really be present on the landscape. You have a lot of equipment, you're moving in there, you're using firearms to dispatch animals. And I think that needs to be done in coordination with landowners. So the timing is good now with the recent change to prohibit wild boar farms, that we can re-engage with these landowners and really try to work to get them on board. And I think peer pressure through their own community is probably what's going to help us in the end. Another gap we have is enforcement support. So our hunting and trapping prohibitions are great, but we need people to be enforcing those. And currently, we don't quite have that sorted out under our regulatory authorities. That the right people to be doing the enforcement are not the people that have authority currently. So that there's some work to do there. But I do see a way forward, because we had a lot of success with our aquatic invasive species program, where in the early days, commercial vehicle officers kind of joined forces to help with enforcement of the Fisheries Act at the places where the inspections were happening. And so I'm kind of using that as my example to work on, is to try and build some collaborations. I think increased penalties are also important. Currently, the penalty under the Agricultural Pest Act is only $5,000. And if we look at penalties around the Fisheries Act in Alberta related to zebra and quagga mussels, they can be up to $100,000 or $500,000 for corporations. And they also have administrative penalties around failing to stop at inspection stations and failing to pull the plug, which are kind of eye-popping. Like $4,200 for failing to stop, or $600 for failing to pull the plug. But I think these are serious penalties, and I don't see a reason why Alberta should treat wild boar and agricultural pests any different than invasive mussels. They all have large economic impacts. So I think that there's maybe some path forward on this for us as well. I think another sort of lurking problem is escaped domestic pigs. If you look back at the graph of reports over time, the red are ones that we're able to confirm as escaped domestic pigs. And you can see that, I mean, that's making up almost half of our reports in 2025. And these pictures are all from pigs I received just since October, being reported as wild boar that are escaped domestic pigs. And they're just out for the day or for a few days and then going back. And I think they all represent the same risk of disease transmission and potential damage. Perhaps a little lower risk because they're not establishing free living, reproducing populations, but certainly in terms of disease spread, the risk is there as well. I think this is something that other Canadian provinces are also struggling with. And so we need to look at ways in Alberta to look at policy that will allow us to address this problem as well. Certainly, Ontario has already addressed this by including all wild pigs under their invasive species legislation. The idea, I think, of an invasive species as a human construct, and therefore how we perceive them is important, and it will affect how effective we are. And with wild boar, it has, confusion around what people want to call it as a name, but it also has confusion around how people see it. Some people see it as an invasive species, other people see it as an exciting hunting opportunity, and it's also a food source for many people. And I think this is a common challenge across their invaded range, particularly depending on how long they've been around and how deeply developed the relationships between people and wild boar are, kind of determines how big a challenge it is. Certainly in Alberta, they're relatively new and occur at such a low density that while some do view them as a big game animal and a hunting opportunity, we don't really have a long history of wild boar here. And I think that will hopefully help people make this transition to where they're squarely agricultural pests. But it really underlines that outreach is needed to help bridge these gaps and build understanding and buy-in with regulations. And just like access, I think this just takes time. And then I think the last gap that I identified that is probably familiar to people working in all sorts of invasive species programs everywhere is the long-term funding and response capacity and the challenge of maintaining that over time. And I think that the risk is that the program will disappear before wild boar are entirely eliminated and leaving the door open for them to rebound and spread. And because we know that they're such high reproductive capacity, that rebound, there's nothing that will prevent that rebound from happening if there's no response program. I think this is particularly challenging because as the numbers decline, the cost of detecting and removing those last few individuals be high, and that becomes a challenging sell for managers and politicians who have to balance a lot of competing demands on resources. And so I think that makes the continued engagement and communication about the program really essential, and also having data to show our progress. And then in addition, it's not really possible to remain at a high level of response readiness in perpetuity. So to have a large number of people ready to respond when you haven't had a report in a few years, but you never know if you will, is a challenge. And so we need to think about creative ways to build capacity into already existing groups, and so that we're able to maintain an early detection and rapid response, even once the larger control effort winds down. So hopefully that has given you a bit of a sense of some of the things happening in Alberta around wild boar control and maybe some of the bigger questions that people trying to tackle wild boar share across their invaded range. And I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks everybody for joining us today. That was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciated all the lessons learned at the end. I think even people managing other species, especially when they get down to just those last few, will relate to that. How do you have the resources to deal with those? So, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions here. And again, anyone in the audience, if you have additional questions, please put those in the Q&A box. But our first one here, we have very informative presentation. You mentioned the negative impacts of wallowing on ecosystems. However, a main characteristic of wood and plains bison is wallowing as well. Bison do not exist in the same numbers in Alberta as they once did, but are considered keystone species in their habitats of the plains and foothills. So why characterize wallowing as a negative impact for wild boar? Are they not filling the wallowing niche in some way?
Yeah, that's interesting. And not really knowing much about bison, I hesitate to wade too far too far into comparing the two species. In particular, I suspect perhaps the habitats um, that they live in may be different, but I think I'll just be better off if I don't try to go beyond my own expertise. But that is something that I'll look into. And certainly, you know, um, I have seen some articles suggesting that wild boar are important for, you know, positive effects on ecosystems. And I think it's probably really a very case by case situation what those impacts are. But yeah, that's interesting, and I'll try to look into that a bit more.
Yeah. And then someone else has commented that they've seen wild boar on menus and they're curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Certainly in Alberta, there are some restaurants that serve wild boar, and I mean, there's up until December, it was legal to farm wild boar, and currently it still is for producers that are participating in the exit program. So we do still have wild boar being produced in Alberta for now, and I think that one thing I'd say is that some of that wild boar on menus might be a bit of creative licensing with the term wild boar, and that sometimes it might just be domestic pig. And then, yeah, it's interesting to think about. I mean, certainly lots of people talk about the benefits of eating invasive species and trying to reduce their populations that way. But I think um, lots of examples where you try to encourage people to, hunt or fish or eat invasive species with the goal of eliminating them, run into challenges when you establish industries around that and then you get close to eliminating them and all of a sudden people's goals don't entirely align. Um, so yeah, it's a good question, and certainly I know in Alberta there's lots of dog food has wild boar in the the
Mm.
list of species, and it's very like sought after dog food. So it'll be interesting to see. I think generally across Canada and probably elsewhere in the United States as well, restrictions on farming wild boar are really getting much stricter. In Ontario, they prohibited wild boar farming in 2022 and they finished their phase out of farms in 2024. Manitoba has recently prohibited wild boar and currently has no farms that they were licensing prior to that prohibition. Saskatchewan has really increased their regulations around wild boar farms, and the Yukon also recently prohibited wild boar farms. So I think that just the availability of wild boar um, in production is just much reduced. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on the market side.
No, definitely. Is there any way to use resources for control and monitoring across multiple species? This might help with maintaining resources over the whole control effort, regardless of population of the pest.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I thought about it a little bit in the terms of eDNA, because we do have, well, I guess we have a few different monitoring networks in Alberta. So there is a lot of water sampling done to look at kind of metapopulation presence of different species using eDNA. And certainly that technique has been developed in the United States as well for wild boar. And so it's a possibility. Um, Although the kind of sampling large lakes is unlikely to really capture wild boar because they're much more of kind of a smaller water body user. But potentially we could overlap there. And then also the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute has a lot of systematic monitoring focusing on camera traps and some other types of sensors. And certainly we have had some wild boar reports through that system, but not as many as you'd think in areas where we know there are wild boar populations and they also have overlapping grids. And so I think, it's probably people will say this for everyone would say this for their own species, but I'll say it for wild boar is that you really need to put it where you put your camera has a lot to do with what your detection probability is. And so something that works to detect other species may miss entirely the presence of wild boar. But I think something worthwhile to think about, and the more you can integrate species of concern into other monitoring, the better chances you have of detecting them. So definitely something to think about, but something we haven't really done yet.
No, that's great. We have a couple questions in the Q&A more about the biology of wild boars. Uh, Someone's asking what the reproductive seasons of them are, and you'd mentioned sometimes they can have multiple litters. And then how far can a male wild boar move a year on average? So what is their movement range?
Yeah, so I can try to say a bit about that. Certainly, that's where we lean a lot on our research collaborators. In terms of reproduction, there's been some work in the Prouveau lab to look at all of our captured wild boar and try to understand a little bit about um, some of the population parameters. And what they've found, really based on looking at pregnancy and fetus counts, is that wild boar can reproduce at any time in Alberta. So there's definitely peaks, but there's multiple peaks, and one of the peaks occurs in the winter, and that lines up with
Mm.
what we see on camera with tiny piglets at -30. And really, that sows are quite good mothers, and they're able to help their piglets thermoregulate a lot. And so we are seeing reproduction throughout the year. In terms of the male movements, I think that that would change quite a lot depending on the density of females. And I think if, yeah, there wouldn't really be a limit to the movement that a male might undertake. I know that Dr. Brooke in Saskatchewan has done quite a bit of work looking at home range, and we have some data now in Alberta that's starting to look at that, but I can't really pull numbers to the top of my head that I would feel confident in, but they can move significantly for sure.
That's great. All right. Well, we are getting close to the top of the hour, so I'm going to pull up my final slides, but I want to thank you again so much for joining us today. Hannah, that was a fantastic presentation, and I definitely learned a lot. And for anyone here interested in hearing more about this species, please join us in April for that webinar too. But thank you so much. And you're getting great reactions here.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And so for National Invasive Species Awareness Week, we do like to end our webinars with a call to action. So today we'd like to ask you to send a letter to your federal representatives in the House and Senate asking them to support the If You See It, Squish It Act. This bill will authorize the Secretary of Agriculture to carry out a national campaign to increase the awareness and knowledge of the public with respect to spotted lanternflies. Some of you may remember the spotted lanternfly was our Know Your Invasive species for last year. You can either scan this QR code or we'll also provide a link in the chat pointing to this letter. And there are multiple bills in there as well that you can find your support for. So lastly, we still have a great lineup of webinars scheduled for this week, so please do register for those. And as a reminder, we'll be posting all of these to NASMA's YouTube channel sometime next week. But again, thank you so much for being here. Happy National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We so appreciate how so many of you are helping to share this message online as well. And so it's just, yeah, really great to see you all here. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I will keep that link up there for a moment and we'll hopefully see some of you tomorrow.